Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest. This is a podcast that will cover topics from the era of history known as Classical Antiquity, the period of time that is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Now, our first side quest, and just so you understand where this term comes from, my son accuses me of taking him on side quests whenever we go somewhere and straying from the preordained plot. I disagree with that, but whatever. So that's where the name side quest is brought into this. And this first side quest begins with really the most, I think, appropriate topic to begin a podcast about classical antiquity, and that is Alexander the Great. We all know he became king of Macedon in about 336 BCE. And at the time of his death, a mere 13 years later in 323 BCE, he had conquered Greece, Egypt, the Persian Empire, and parts of India. And in fact, would likely have gone much farther had he not died prematurely. He left a very, very interesting legacy behind him that we'll talk about in more detail momentarily. But many of his most important projects were cities. Some of the cities named after him include Alexandria in Egypt, Kandahar in Afghanistan, and other cities throughout the Hindu Kush, Pakistan, Iraq, and other areas. Now, I am not an expert on Alexander the Great, and as you know from my other podcast in which we've done classical antiquity themed episodes, I like to bring on people who know more about the topic than I do to have a question and answer session and an informative discussion about whatever topic we're going to get into. I am just really the facilitator here primarily. And our guest is a friend of mine who is like me in the sense that he is an amateur historian. He does know a great deal about military history, which is not a topic that I've ever gotten particularly into. And that's going to be very important as we talk about this, about Alexander the Great and his many achievements throughout his brief reign. Victor Lamas, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Well, I'm glad to do it. And before we get into Alexander, one of the things that I like to do over at the other podcast is give our guests a chance to tell the audience a little bit about their origin story. And what I'd like you to talk a little bit about is how you ended up being so interested in history and particularly ancient history. And just so the audience knows, you and I started talking about Roman history. I think it was last year or maybe last soccer season or whenever it was. But just tell us a little bit about how you got into this era of history specifically.
So, two words, dad and books. My parents were readers and they didn't read to me much as a kid, but I saw them reading all the time. So our household was filled with books. And so I, as a kid, just started, we just read. And my father had books lying around, and I started to read those. And occasionally I would pick up a book and try, and I wasn't quite able to get through it in the beginning because it was too hard. And then the first book I got through and absolutely adored is Shogun, right? My father had the novel Shogun about a English navigator who gets stranded in feudal Japan. And now they have a miniseries on Hulu, another remake of another miniseries, but from that book. And so that led me to another book and another book. And so my father was a lover of history and military history and reading. So I just imitated him. And so one book leads to another and leads to another. And and eventually I loved historical novels, and the historical novels lead you to the other sources, right? Again, it was historical fiction was such a gateway for me to then read the original sources and other things. With Roman and ancient history, it was historical novels as well that I read that led me. One was about the Assyrians, and then there was this series of novels by the Thornbirds author, Colleen McCullough. She wrote an amazing series about the fall of the Republic that ends with Antony and Augustus and Cleopatra, but began 100 years earlier with Gaius Marius and the beginning of the fall of the Republic and Julius Caesar. And so again, those books and my father's example led me to just simply read every single thing I could get my hands on.
I want to ask a little bit about the way you incorporated a lot of people won't know this unless they had listened to the Roman history episode that we did with Dr. Jennifer Garish. I mentioned how you, for some of the classes that you taught for the lower school here in town, you would have them recreate famous historical ancient battles. Is that right?
Yes, that was a lot of fun. We it just became called the battle, right? And I did that for 10 years, and each one grew more ambitious than the previous one. I would have parents make me wooden shields, swords. We would paint them. They would make me costumes. We first started with a hoplite march with spears and shields and helmets, and then and then I incorporated my first battle where I would have one side were the Romans and the other side were the Celts, right? Julius Caesar's invasion and conquest of Gaul. We had javelin throwing, uh, the tortoise formation, all sorts of things. Body paint, the Gauls the boys and girls would have their hairs spiked up with lime. One year we did the Trojan War. One year we did the Battle of Cannae. We did the Revolt of Spartacus with a gladiatorial display. Um, and then the last one we did was a Viking shield wall battle. Um, and everyone got involved. The school would come out. It was a lot of fun. It was choreographed. I think I have a movie producer director inside of me that just turned these into big movie battle productions. I'd have Conan music or all sorts of music blaring on the speakers, and we'd make YouTube videos out of them.
Two comments on that. One, you mentioned Troy. I'm actually reading the Aeneid now, although I don't have it. Oh no, it's over there. I have it. I'm reading it now, and they're actually just getting to the part in book two where they have a debate about whether to bring the horse inside the gates of
Mhm.
Troy, which I find interesting because I'm not sure. And at some point, I would like to cover this in more detail on this podcast. I'm not sure. There's kind of this literary movement now that sort of dismisses the Aeneid as just fanfic of the Odyssey, but I think it's really more telling a story about the death of the Roman Republic, and it's fairly coded, but you that kind of seems to really beat through there. But we can talk more about that another day. The other thing though about the battles is Mac, for the audience, that's my son's name. He is very upset that his class didn't get to do one. He is in ninth grade now, and he's
Yes,
still upset that his class missed out on that.
I uh I get that a lot. I can't I'm in an administrative role now. I'm no longer the fifth grade teacher. I've encouraged people, but I cannot force other teachers to immerse themselves in the utter uh nerd nerd nerddom, and it's an intense nerd experience of going through this with your class. If you're not really into it, then I can't mandate it. But if they ever allow me to become a fifth grade teacher again, you'll be darn sure that the battle's coming back.
Well, one of the things too about reading military history is a lot of the writers are not great. I remember that from my history classes. It's
Right.
it's very dry and it's very I don't think it necessarily cures insomnia. I think it sort of creates it because you can easily fall asleep reading it and then you're awake all night. But you can get really lost in the minutia of it and it's hard to follow. So if it's
Yep.
not your primary interest, I think it can be very difficult for somebody just to want to pick it up. But I think I'm going to have the boy try to figure out a way to do this maybe with some of his older friends and they can recreate it on their own, really get into it.
Absolutely. You'd be amazed what they can do if they're into it. And I hear you what you say about the writing. In some ways, military history, more than the actual tactics, sometimes it's not. It's just simply the stories. Histories are stories, and battles are sometimes they're simply just stories, and how high drama, and that's often what has attracted me to that, and in particular in some ways the Western way of war. where you have people willing to risk it all, right, on one event. Not every culture often wages war like that. Um, Wages war in a way that risks everything, right, in one battle. And so many things have turned in one battle sometimes. And Alexander epitomizes belief in that sense, the belief that he is going to prevail, but the willingness to risk so much often on these on belief, on the belief in his plan, and he always convinced his men, I mean, to risk it all with him. And so that's often what's attracted me to all these military things because of just the drama involved.
Well, to start with Alexander, though, I think we need to go back in time a little bit. One of the things that I did not know about until I started getting ready for this and listening to more of the podcasts that you and I have talked about that about Roman history was this is, I think, a gross oversimplification, but in many ways, Alexander inherited a great situation from his father,
Yep.
Philip.
Yes.
Philip is a truly remarkable character, and Alexander took over something and really just ran with it. Can you talk a little bit about Philip and why, if we're going to study Alexander, we need to spend an appropriate amount of time understanding his father?
Absolutely. I mean, Philip, in some ways, Philip fascinates me as much as Alexander. Philip, you read, he was an important person, even if Alexander had died young or had not existed in the way that he did. Philip took a took a kingdom that the Greeks viewed as up in the north, north of Greece, Macedonia, and at that time it was as tribal and in some ways as Homeric in its primitivism and its clan fights amongst themselves, and and created a great power. At the Before Philip grew up. He wasn't even supposed to be king. He inherited when I think his brother was killed, and his kingdom, Macedonia, was at the point of being overrun by these even more northern barbarian folks called the Illyrians. He grew up as a young man in Thebes and he learned the art of war in Thebes. And when he returned, he had to return to Macedonia to take over when I think his brother died. He transformed, he transformed Macedonia, grinding it out. But over a couple of decades, he transformed into the main power in Greece and created an army that Alexander used to conquer, the known world at that time, the Persian Empire. Philip is a very interesting guy. He won most of his battles. He was more content to use treachery, diplomacy, paying people off to win as much as battles. He he took so he created what we would think of as a professional army, right? He was lucky enough to get a silver mine, to discover a silver ore deposit, and he minted that money and he used that to pay soldiers to fight year round. Back then and after Alexander, most people fought in the summer. Philip trained his army year round, paid them well, and he often went to war in winter when there often were no armies to oppose him. He did many things. He created in some ways a very scientific army. He took the 9 foot long famous Greek spear, the hoplite spear, and he lengthened it to 16 feet. And he created so he basically and he created these units, these square units, 16 by 16, and he trained them just year round, and he used the infantry as a way of holding his enemy, right, with longer spears, the sarissas. You needed 2 hands, right, so your shield was sort of an afterthought. It was slung over your shoulder, and his idea always was to hold the other enemy infantry in place. With that, it wasn't really designed to win the battle, hold them in place, and to use the cavalry as sort of the punch, right? The army was the shield, clench them and then use the cavalry to often deliver the killing blow. But he trained it and he paid it to fight year round. He's a fascinating guy. He was a funny guy. He was a guy's guy. He was one of a first amongst equals. He lost an eye, so he had an eye patch. His relationship with Alexander's mother is a fascinating one, and his relationship with his son Alexander is a fascinating one as well. They had a love-hate relationship, pride and defiance. Philip often mocked his son, but was also fiercely proud of him. Uh, there are many great stories between of a young Alexander and a Philip. You can sense in Alexander's history one who was always protective of his mother, took her side, and yet always wanted his father's approval and love. There's one quick story about Philip that always cracks me up. Kings back then often had to spend their time just in boring court cases, right? Like Judge Judy. Just sit there and listen to, and often what we would consider small claims court. And there's a famous story where this woman, it was something about a real estate deal or something, and he was bored and he'd started drinking a bit. And so by the time it was her turn and towards the end, he's kind of drunk and he's irritable and drunk. And so she gives her, lays out the details, and he quickly decides against her. And she gets angry and she yells at him. And he's like, I appeal. And he was drunk and irritated. Who are you going to appeal to, woman? I'm the king. I'm the final judge. And she said, well, I appeal from Philip drunk to Philip sober. And he kind of nodded his head and he said, come back tomorrow, slurred his words. And the next day he heard the case again and he changed his judgment. Um, that kind of story, it sort of sums him up, right? Uh,
Yeah, he was a really smart guy from the sense of he seemed to get what it took to develop a plan, institute a plan. He also introduced the phalanx or changed it in a way that hadn't been used before,
that's right.
and really made the army work. But I mean, obviously he did teach Alexander, I think, a lot about diplomatic efforts, which we can talk about more because I think that's something that Alexander may not get enough credit for in our kind of general understanding about him. But he, Philip is murdered in a very Game of Thrones Red Wedding style assassination, right? So tell us a little bit about that and then set us up to where Alexander is. And he's going to, well, I did want to mention this before we leave. Philip had taken essentially what was, to go way back and some deep nerd reference here, a ragtag fugitive fleet of Macedonians and turned that into a very respectable kingdom
Yes.
that was a danger to Greece. And now Alexander's going to inherit it, right? So talk about how Philip dies, one, and then what is Alexander going to do next to take over?
So Philip, by the time I think he's grizzled in his 50s or so, he has defeated a combined, like a unified Greek. Athens and cities that constantly fought against each other, they'd unified to try to stop Philip's hegemony. And they lost the battle at the Battle of Chaeronea, right? And Alexander, I think at the age of 18 or 19, was given the command of the left wing and they defeated. And so Philip, Philip was always good about punching you in the face and then holding his hand out and lifting you up. Hey, what we really should be doing is uniting in a war against the Persians. And so Philip had been planning to become the hegemon, this chosen elected leader of a united Greece in a war against Persia, right? As revenge for the Persian invasions of almost 100 years earlier.
Kind of a flimsy excuse, but
Absolutely.
right.
They'd already established a beachhead in Asia Minor, but Philip had Philip at this ceremony where he was going to be declared the hegemon of Greece, the hegemon meaning sort of the leader of this federation or confederacy, that sort of thing. He was stabbed, and the man who stabbed him was a man who blamed Philip because Philip, he believed that Philip had not backed him up in a sort of a lover's quarrel. Um, and so these guys were always having, I mean, these guys, they had love affairs with women and they had love affairs with men and each other. And this man had been treated very shabbily. And so the idea is, A, did the Persians, right? They had everyone had spies everywhere in each other's court. So did the Persians, knowing a very inexpensive way to stop this invasion would be the killing of Philip. So did they suborn this man, this guy who killed Philip? Was he already primed for revenge? Because blood feuds in that era and in that culture were very common, feuds, honor killings, revenge killings. Other suspects were Philip's wife, right? He had just married again. She was worried about her position. She also basically hated Philip. They were, it was more of they were strong personalities. Did she play a part because Philip's younger new bride had just given birth, right, to possibly someone who could usurp her son Alexander's position? One thing that people often forget is that Alexander was not a full Macedonian. He was half Macedonian and half Epirote, right? A kingdom to the west of Macedon, right? So often there were jibes that the heir, the heir needed to be fully Macedonian. So that's another suspect. Um, but what we will never know because the man stabs Philip and then runs to his getaway horse, but tripped and fell and could not make a clean getaway. And all of the men in their anger, right, killed him. There's a little bit of a Jack Ruby thing there, maybe, or Lee Harvey Oswald, right? And Alexander was immediately proclaimed king. Do we think that Alexander himself knew about that? Um, there are many arguments. Maybe, maybe not. Although killing's one father, patricide obviously is a very big no-no in Greek culture back then, and mythology, right? The punishments were pretty severe. Um, but Alexander was not above. He was not above murder, right? He was a part of that, buccaneer brutal culture. So when he became king, your usual people were all killed, cousins, anyone who could, he and his, anyone who could claim his throne with him was killed. So he, it was definitely. I don't know if that's the Red Wedding. What was the other one where Joffrey was killed? That might be.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
forget, the Purple Wedding or something like that. But
yeah. It was. I mean, it was an interesting time, and he kind of takes over and wastes no time consolidating his power, getting rid of who he needs to get rid of, and pushing forward. But it was interesting what you said about sexual norms back then. With this Netflix documentary that came out about Alexander the Great that I watched, and I thought they had a really good panel of experts on there. There were some people online complaining about how the documentary made Alexander appear gay, and I just was like, you all are going to be really disappointed when you open a history book and see what accepted sexual practices were back in ancient times. But that's a discussion for another day and a much longer topic. But so Alexander wastes no time taking control of the region,
Mhm.
and in almost no time, he goes from Macedon to the emperor of the known world. So, I mean, he defeats at then what was probably the greatest empire in history in the Persian Empire, but he does it through a mix of military victory and also diplomatic feats. Talk a little bit about kind of his strategy and how he utilized more than just the tactic of brute force.
right. I mean, Alexander often doesn't get enough credit. In some ways, he's so famous that he often doesn't get enough credit for I mean, he was extremely intelligent. He had a supreme sense of belief in himself, but he could be insecure about about a few things. But in terms of war, and diplomacy and strategy, he's pretty much right there at the top. So for example, yes, he took his father's army with his father's generals and his own, cadre of young officers that he'd grown up with, and with this they were loyal to him, and they were also loyal to the memory of his father. So he went into Asia Minor, what we call Turkey, and he fought and defeated his first, Persian army at the Battle of the Granicus River. And then from there, yeah, he marches to the old site of Troy. It's again, it's very difficult to overstate the importance in Greek culture, Macedonian culture, all of these cultures of the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Greek mythological tales. So there at the site of Troy, he ran a race. There were games. He at the altar of Achilles, right? His hero was Achilles, which is kind of funny because Achilles was a hothead, and I mean, wasn't one they would think of as like a great military genius, but all of the things he often tried to recreate that. It was when you're talking about strategy, it was when, for example, the Persians had conquered Egypt. And they, at this time, their religion, they treated the Egyptian gods and the priests very shabbily, very, very poorly, which is just, it's dumb because always starting religious hatreds in a place is not a way to get a population to like you. Whereas when Alexander entered Egypt, he did it without any struggle. He sacrificed to the Egyptian gods, he paid them great respect, and they in turn declared him to be the son of Amun, right? Polytheistic religions are often, see, the Persians had a sort of monotheistic religion, and it made them very less, in some ways, many less tolerant of other people's gods. And in this case, Alexander's polytheistic religion, it was very easy to say to equate Amun with Zeus. And so Alexander was very shrewd in connecting himself and showing respect to the Egyptian gods. So they declared him the pharaoh, and Egypt was his fairly easily. Um, and
Yeah,
and at some point he went to this oasis place, this temple, and we don't know what the priest told him, but it was quite possible, right, that they told him that some of the rumors and some of the stuff that his own mom used to tell him was, Philip's not your father, Zeus is your father. And how much Alexander believed that is tough to tell.
but one of the things that he was good at was he let that rumor get out there. He adopted it. He didn't run from it. And he went to, you mentioned going to Troy, he went to the site of the Gordian knot. And this kind of demonstrated, I thought, his unique ability. There's different versions of the story. One is he just cleaves the knot and cuts it. The other is he very carefully lets the pin out of the back so the knot can fall apart, and the obviously cleaving it in half and cutting it is a lot more famous and a much better story to tell. But when I was watching the documentary and when I was listening to the podcast about that, what I kind of said to myself was, but for his excesses and drinking too much, this guy is the total package as far as he knows how to market himself. He knows how to campaign, and he also knows how to win battles, right? And that's one of the things that I want to ask you about. Dude never lost in battle, right?
He never, no. Caesar was off. Julius Caesar was often caught. He was often caught by surprise. He often had to win a battle, but he often caused that battle to happen because of sometimes his rash decisions or his lack of supplying his army well. Hannibal famously was a great tactician, but maybe not a great strategist. Um, Whereas Alexander and some generals were good at fighting battles, but avoided sieges, etc., and vice versa. Alexander, even small, for example, I mean, the most famous example is that he conquered Afghanistan, right? He also knew when to get out of Afghanistan. He basically did as much as he could, and then he married his way out, right? Eventually, he found the toughest, biggest Afghan warlord there and defeated him, but also realized that the easiest thing to do was simply to marry into the family and then extricate his army without in a very dignified and meaning quit while you're ahead. He took the city of Tyre. He was so siege warfare. I mean, there was this one part of the city that was almost like half a mile out into the sea, and he just built this huge causeway, right? Granted, it took a while, and he was so angry when he finally took it that he had some of the survivors crucified along along the walls of that. But
It
even
was the
guerrilla
style. It was
warfare,
the style at the time.
it was what was expected. But any even short wars, if the best book about this is JFC Fuller's The Generalship of Alexander the Great, even short little wars, even short little battles, small battles. Um, at one point he was in Afghanistan, and he told his men to cut their sarissas down, shorten them up because it would be better for this style of warfare. At the beginning of his when his father was killed, a few of the places in Greece rebelled. They said, "Oh, okay, we don't know who this guy Alexander is. We're not doing this hegemon stuff." And he had to force march everywhere and reestablish his control. He mountain warfare, the taking of hilltop fortresses, um, all sorts of things. Small battles, big set piece battles, of which there were four. The most impressive one is the most complicated one, the battle against an Indian king named Porus. He had to take one section of his army and cross it in a river in the rain and keep this other part, a separate. He had to fight against elephants. At no point, and obviously he didn't do it by himself. He had amazing officers and generals under his command. But he was the total package as both a soldier, right? He participated in the attacks himself, often to his detriment and to the risk of his life. But his battle plans always seemed to work. And he was also, if you caught him by surprise, he didn't freeze, right? I think one of the most famous great plans for example, in American military history is George Hooker's plan to defeat Lee at Chancellorsville should have worked. But Lee discovered that Lee was turned around and was coming towards him, and then apparently Hooker froze, right? If he had just stuck to his plan, he still could have defeated. But whereas when at the Battle of Isis, right, it turns out that the Persian king Darius III was in his rear to his surprise, right? We didn't have drones back then, and the only way you could get information was horseback and all sorts of things. So sometimes surprises happen. Alexander did not miss a beat. He turned around and had to change his plan on the fly to fight against Darius at the Battle of Isis, and he won. And then he defeated an even bigger army of Darius III. Each of these armies either outnumbered him by 3-1 or 5-1.
Yeah,
But even when it was the small things, he was a master.
and at ISIS, if I remember correctly, he was A, grossly outnumbered, B, sort of trapped against water,
Right.
but he had planned for that and he kept his best troops there in the middle and he just waited for that moment and they held as long as he could. And as soon as he saw his moment, he goes and just hits the Persians and like the emperor flees. And then I guess the tradition was you would bring your wife and your family to the battlefield and now they're Alexander's, right?
Yep. And he treated them with respect. But yes, I mean, you were confident. I mean, Darius III was confident of victory, but you're right. It was the custom to bring, sometimes the custom to bring a fair bit of money with you as well to pay the soldiers, right, bonuses after a battle. Or sometimes you brought all this stuff with you because you weren't quite sure that you should leave it behind you, right? So you brought your stuff with you. There's a, I mean, people often brought their possessions with them in the war because they couldn't quite trust the people behind them to keep an eye on it or to not betray them.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I think that was part of why, to go off topic on a side quest, there was something that was part of what steered Constantine towards Christianity, is he felt like he could trust Christians to handle the money of the empire more so than he could other folks. But um, what you say though about the soldiers and to pay your mercenaries, because there were a lot of Greek mercenaries who were fighting with the Persians even.
Yes.
But to pay your soldiers, to paraphrase Mike Duncan, always pay them in full and tip 20%, because the last thing you want is mad soldiers who riot against you. But I mean, at some point, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this. If you run simulations, right? You run computer simulations, or you run battle strategies back then as you're preparing for the fight. You've got to say 95 times out of 100, this plan that we have to defeat Alexander and the Macedonians will work. But it just never worked, right?
Hmm.
And I'm just curious. You've read a lot about this, certainly more than I have. What do you think it was that made Alexander and his generals and his soldiers so different? Was it growing up in Macedon? Was it having to fight for 20 or 30 years? Was it just Alexander was so determined to prevail that he just wasn't going to accept defeat? I mean, what was it?
So a few, I mean, all those things that you said are part of that, right? It's a bits and pieces of all that. The Macedonian, first of all, in some ways, it's the equipment. The Macedonian sarissa, the long spear, and their cavalry was is sort of heavy cavalry. So it was good. It was good for the style of fighting that, in other words, they forced the Persians, or the Persians gave them what they wanted, which is to fight these battles that favored the Macedonian equipment, right? The long spears, the heavy cavalry. Um, and these men had been training their whole lives together. And another thing that often gets forgotten is their horses had been training with them, right? It often, as they said, a guy wept if he lost a cavalryman, but he tore his hair out if he lost a cavalry horse, because it took as long to train these horses and more than it did even the men. Um, and all of these men had been through the wars with Philip, and many of them had been fighting with Philip their whole lives. I mean, there were a lot of grizzled veterans, and they mixed the young rookies with the veterans. So Alexander knew his men. I mean, it's sort of like a professional basketball team that's just been playing together for so long. They knew each other and they trusted each other. Whereas Darius III, did not have the self-belief that Alexander did in himself. And the Persian army had its core of Persians, but then it was also a motley array of conscripted soldiers from other parts of the empire, and often the languages are different, the fighting styles were different, and obviously there wasn't that loyalty, right? One say, well, the Persians are fighting for their homeland. Well, not all of them were. And whereas the Macedonians, in some sense, they had burned their boats, and so they were, right? They had to win or die, right? You win or you die, that sort of thing. Whereas a lot of the imperial army of the Persians, when they saw Philip skedaddle and that run through the ranks, right, the immediate response is, well, then why are we sticking around? And so Alexander very shrewdly understood that whatever happened in this battle, his men just all they had to do was last long enough for Alexander to, with his wedge of horsemen, to find a gap somewhere and then to go attack Darius the Third personally. And that strategy, but then there's the cultural thing, is that Alexander wants, he also, as a king, immersed in Homeric legends that he believes in explicitly, he wants Achilles versus Hector. And he could not believe it that Darius ran away. It just wasn't his conception that a king would do that.
And you mentioned teams who play together for a long time. Since it is March and we are in the midst of the NCAA tournament, I would just, since gambling is legal in a lot of places now that people listen to this, take the older teams, especially with the way the NCAA botched the COVID year. And now we have a lot of 60-year players. As we saw, those guys are going to be better than your freshmen. Okay. And that's generally how it plays out. So, anyway, that COVID year and the fifth and sixth year guys will not continue for much longer. So, it might be a level playing ground soon. But, one of the things that I was kind of interested in Alexander, or that I found interesting about Alexander, I should say, is that okay, so he hits he hits India, and he wants to keep going. He wants to go and conquer more and just keep winning more. And I listened to a couple of, this was kind of swirling around in my head. Part of it may have been running an empire is really boring, right? Like you talked about listening to a bunch of court cases, you're getting a bunch of letters from people. You
Yeah.
don't really care about that. And you just kind of say to yourself, I know what I'm doing out in the field. But his soldiers sort of mutiny against him, or at least that's the way it's recounted. What happened? I mean, obviously, we may not ever actually know, but they they turn back, and he ends up in Babylon, where he's going to set up his empire for the future. But let's play a little historical what if. Let's say he doesn't die from whatever it is that kills him. And we know there's some legend about that. And we'll talk about the terrible movies that have been made about Alexander in a little bit. But what do you think would have happened if he had not died? Do you think he goes back to India? I know they talked maybe he's going to go more into the Arabian Peninsula. Would he go back west and maybe hit Rome up and see what's going on in Italy? What do you think he would have done?
Well, the one thing we're pretty sure he would have done is the conquest of Arabia. There were plans to do that. So had he not died, there were plans to conquer Arabia. Um, I don't know if you conquer Arabia, that leaves you obviously the coast. Does that mean that you conquer, Ethiopia, right? Or do you go through Egypt and then go south? Right. I mean, at this time, Rome is just starting to make its way as the most powerful political force and military force in Italy. It's only 50 years after Alexander dies that a late, like a cousin, right? A cousin of Alexander, an Epirot king by the name of Pyrrhus, will Alexander fight against the Romans and win a few battles and then and then lose the last one. Um, it's hard to tell. I do think that I think Alexander is the type of guy who would have gotten bored, and he would have tried to amass, recruit another army, maybe of more of Persians and other folks in that area, and he would have gone off a conquering. It's probably in some ways to his benefit that he did not, because I don't know. Sometimes your luck runs out, right? Maybe the Romans, had he marched into Rome, the amount of manpower and the culture of the Romans might have meant that they never would have given up, right? No matter how many times Alexander defeated them. But for the first, I mean, the sure thing we can be somewhat certain is he would have conquered all of the lands of Arabia. Obviously, the ones worth conquering, not the scorching desert parts. Um,
Where all the where all the Roman emperors went to die at some point.
I mean, even the things, yes, even a few emperors that tried to imitate Alexander, like Trajan, they conquered Mesopotamia, and then they quickly realized it was difficult to hold, and so they skedaddled. Oof. I mean, the amount of punishment that Alexander's body had taken over the years, I think what killed him, there's some folks that think he was poisoned, but for sure, what helped that was some wounds that he suffered on his way back from India. Some pretty rough, stabbing wounds, probably helped to do him in. I think there was one, if I remember the books I read, that never really healed well. So he probably wasn't long for this world. If that thing hadn't killed him in Babylon in 323, something else would have probably soon after, and it probably would have been some illness. Or did he drink? I mean, did he drink? He didn't drink any more probably than all the other Macedonian rough soldiers at these drinking parties.
It was a rough time, man. I mean, it couldn't have been a pleasant life to lead.
Well, I mean, let's say define pleasant, right? They got meaning out of it. They got meaning and fulfillment, and they were used to their bodies. In some ways, they were used to probably a level of ignoring and being proud of their wounds, a level of just sitting on horses, a level of just physical inconvenience that to us seems really hard, but to them was probably it was just a regular Tuesday morning.
Yeah, he was what, in his 30s when he died.
Yes,
So,
he
but
was
he
30,
probably went,
33.
if you calculate that in battle years, in antiquity battle years, he's pushing 70.
Well,
that had to be, and I'm not, I'm just saying that had
yeah.
to be, think about marching from Macedon to India, into Afghanistan, back to Babylon. Egypt, all that. That had to be physically, just to take, that would take a lot out of you.
And he could not do any less than his men, right? His own pride and the Macedonian, war culture. He couldn't take it soft on the march while there's a famous story, right? When they were marching back from India through a desert and his men are dying of thirst and they're suffering, his men discover this dirty, whatever, little pond of water, but this is their love and loyalty to their king. There's almost nothing left. So they took some helmet, they filled it up with what they could, and they ran to Alexander and say, "Here, king, drink." And Alexander's just lips are as dried and he's as thirsty as anybody else. And everyone's watching him and they're all, like, drink, drink. And he takes the helmet and in front of everyone, he pours the water into the dirt or the sand, right? And so imagine imagine the expectations of just suffering that these guys had. Um, no one would have reproached him if he had drunk, right? Who of us would have drunk, right? But of course that had to have taken a toll over time on his body. The amount of bones broken that we probably don't even know about. The stoving of fingers, the just all sorts of stuff. That guy was probably a handsome but gnarled, you know. We see the statues of him, right? All the statues, of course, are all polished, and he's looking up. But the real Alexander at 33 must have been a formidable. There must have been a lot of stuff on his face, right? That could have told you things.
Yeah, the statues were the Photoshop of the day, but
Mhm.
if I think Philip too had a wound in his leg that never healed
Yep.
appropriately, or an injury to his leg, and he kept going.
And
He didn't stop.
he had a scar from he had like this scar in his eye. He must have looked pretty hideous. But that was the expectation, I guess, especially for in Macedon. Probably a thing that might make they were Highlanders, right? There were two kinds of Macedonians. There were the Lowlanders and the Highlanders. And mountain people are tough, right? Mountain people in any continent, they are really hard people. They're hard to conquer, and they have very clannish cultures and tough cultures. And these guys were a part of that culture. And they drank. Who knows how many of them probably had a form of syphilis as well. They drank and humped their way to excess when they weren't fighting
I
or
mean,
training. That's
it
the
was
other thing. We forget that they probably spent an inordinate amount of time simply training with their weapons and their horses and all and drilling.
yeah, it was a rough life, and it was not easy. And one of the things though that I've always thought about with Alexander, and I've spent some more time thinking about it, getting ready for today, is how what contributed to his legacy. Obviously, you never lose in battle, so you're the
Right.
guy that every general is going to measure him or herself against going forward. And you saw that with the story about the dinner between Hannibal and Scipio Africanus, where
Yep.
uh, Hannibal says, "Well, clearly Alexander was the greatest general of all time," right? And Augustus, was one of the many people who went to the tomb of Alexander and opened it up after he conquered Egypt and got rid of that pesky Mark Antony fella.
Right.
And for really up until probably Napoleon, Alexander was the guy, and you could make an argument that Napoleon was in many ways copying Alexander. Caesar himself thought he would never measure up to Alexander, or maybe he had that in his mind, moments of doubt. But I'm trying to think. Part of what made Alexander's legacy was that he died when he did. I mean, you part of what made Augustus was that he lived so long, right?
Yeah.
But what made Alexander Alexander was he had basically finished all of his military exploits, had never lost a battle, and you don't really then have to deal with a legacy of the baggage of maybe he would not have been as great of an administrator of that large of an empire because he died when he did. So, what are your thoughts about his legacy and maybe what he is remembered most for, and maybe what we should also think about when we think about Alexander?
I think there's truth to that. I mean, when he died, he also left an heir that was quickly killed. So it just his line basically ended with him. And then there was this squabbling 50-year wars amongst his successors, and all of them also wanted a piece of his legend. Ptolemy Ptolemy famously, one of his generals was the smartest of them. He says, just give me Egypt, right?" And when Alexander died, this big funeral, this big chair, I mean, this huge funeral like train was making its way back to Macedon, and Philip hijacked it and he brought it back to Egypt, right? And he had Alexander buried there, and he founded the city. The other thing that happened very quickly after Alexander died were legends, right? Legends in the parts of the Persian Empire that he had conquered, right? I mean, Alexander's even in the Quran. I mean, he's described very differently. He's Zikander and all sorts of fantastical legends accrued to him. Um, Luckily, though, as this one author says, an account of I mean, Plutarch wrote an account of his life, a Roman by the name of Quintus Curtius Rufus, but the best account we have of his life, the one that we take the most seriously, was by a soldier named Arrian, who actually studied under the Stoic Epictetus, right? Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius and all that. And he wrote what we think of as basically the most accurate account of Alexander's career. Um, what I mean, I mean, he made his way to India. So, I mean, all of the legends there combined with what we know about his life leads us, at least up until recently, leads us to someone who we would think of as somewhat a very attractive figure, right? Dashing, had moments of chivalry, um, almost any, almost any sort of virtuous but military or martial, attributes. You can always find some connection to Alexander. And then often the stuff that he did that nowadays we'd look very askance at, we often forgive because that was just the way people behaved back then. He's had a very good press. The statues don't hurt. Um, and of course, I mean, the fact that other quote great men revered him also kept that alive. I mean, Augustus's seal, if I remember the seal, the one that you put in the wax, right, to official documents, I believe was connected to Alexander. It may have been one that he took from Alexander's body. I may be wrong about that, but it had an Egyptian sphinx, but also had some connection to Alexander the Great. Um, I mean, imagine if we ever find, although probably it doesn't exist. I imagine it was completely robbed, but if we found Alexander's tomb, what an archaeological discovery that would be. Um, but I mean, he's just such fascinating. I think the folks of these times, I mean, just think about the conversation we just had. It's what, there was that joke a few months ago, right? Guys are always thinking about ancient Rome, right? How
Right.
many times a week does a guy think about ancient Rome? Behind that, how many times, who has not heard in some ways of Alexander the Great, even peripherally, and and I mean, and admired that the guy. I mean, nowadays it's the times are different, right? We don't admire, we're taught not to admire these people as much because of the violence, the killing. the despoliation of lands and slaughter um and that's true. I mean, I understand that we often call people the great, and they're really great at killing large groups of people. And Alexander was no different there, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this, but there has been somewhat of a reevaluation of this. But Alexander, I don't think was necessarily that different from other people who existed at the time. Not that that makes it okay, but warfare, invasions, falling, empires falling, that was kind of the way things happened. But I think maybe what made you could kind of criticize Alexander for is we talked about the flimsy pretext for the war. And the Romans, of course, would always try to portray themselves as fighting in a just war. Okay.
Right.
Alexander had some sort of kind of excuse for that. But this book that I listened to, this audiobook version of a biography from like the 1850s, said, look, Alexander, amazing general, very good diplomat, a lot of great things, but he was just a robber on an enormous scale that we can't even comprehend because he just went to Persia and took everything. And I thought that was interesting that even in 1850 there was that kind of an academic discussion about it,
Oh,
which
yeah.
yeah, I mean, so when having teenage kids, you can have this conversation with them, but you just say, look, this is just an ongoing debate that we have about what sort of things, when we look at history, what we're really talking about is what sort of things we value and think are important today, and what sort of things that we admire today. So what you have to do when you study history is look at what's good. Generals study his military tactics all the time, right? Look
Yeah.
at his ability to solve problems. I mean, who would have just been like, it's going to take us about a year, but we're just going to build this bridge. 50
Yep.
feet of bridge, I can get you 50 feet of bridge anywhere. Okay. So he goes and he gets the bridge and he freaking builds the thing. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
that's admirable that he said, look, I don't care. We're going to do it and we're going to stay here till it's done. And he did it. Right. He just built that causeway. So there's a lot to admire about Alexander the Great. And what you were talking about, the Romans back then, if you'd asked how often do you think about Rome, it probably would have been how often do you think about Alexander the Great, right? I mean, he was just that important of a historical figure, and he's
Yep.
certainly worth the study. Which important question: why can't we get a decent movie about him? Why? Because let me
All
let
right.
me before you answer that question, let me tell you, I was going to watch I vaguely remember watching the Alexander movie that Colin Farrell was in. Okay.
Yeah. I want to talk about that movie.
All right. I remember it when it came out, but I don't remember it particularly well. And I was gonna buy it and watch it on Amazon or something. And I had to choose between the ultimate cut and the final cut. And I said, there can't be two of those options. There's either a director's cut and the theatrical release, or I'm out. I'm not investing in 50 different cuts of this
Right.
movie. Pick a theme,
Um,
go with it. So I tried to watch the 56 version. Could not. Got about
Richard Burton. Yeah.
terrible.
You
Just
know, I
awful.
so there has I think the Oliver Stone one's underrated, and I'll tell you in a moment why. I've seen all. By the way, there's an actual William Shatner Alexander the Great movie. You can look for it for free on YouTube. It's a young in the 50s William Shatner, I kid you not. Um, the Richard Burton one's a shame. He was too old for the part. There are parts of it. It's in some ways I actually like their depiction of Macedonia early on, right? I like the guy who played Philip in that movie.
Yeah, he was good.
There are parts of it that I like. There are parts of it that were good, and then it just does the whole Persian thing in about 10 minutes, and the battles are horrible. That's one thing that annoys me about some of those movies is how terrible the battles are staged. One of my favorite movies is, say, for example, The Fall of the Roman Empire, right? Big budget. They spent so much money on costumes are great, and then the battles are just garbage. The Oliver Stone Alexander movie, I would try to find. I think I have the final cut. I The movie's very flawed. I would say this though, and ancient historians, when there are these great YouTube series like how do ancient historians or military guys rate battles, etc. The most accurate depiction of some ancient historical battle is the Oliver Stone one. the battle that they portray Gaugamela, which is really, Isis and Gaugamela put together, and then the Battle of the Hydaspes at the end. But those fight scenes are as realistic and non-Hollywoody that a Hollywood movie can do. Um, they really did train a 256 man Sarissa battalion, and it looks very good. So I would recommend it just for that reason alone. I Oliver Stone apparently was obsessed with that movie, and he got really obsessed with trying to find, trying to cut it, edit it the way that did everything that he wanted. So I enjoy the movie. I think Alexander's life is so, nowadays we have this new cinematic form that it's so good, meaning the 10-part big budget HBO or Netflix series, right? Like Game of Thrones, right? You could do, Rome, HBO's Rome was going to do something like that. And then they sort of got scared at how much money it was costing. And then they compressed what they were going to do seasons 2 through 5 into the second season. And then they were done with it because they thought it was costing too much money. But treating the history stuff in these 10-part big budget production value, you see it with Shogun now on Hulu. That I think would be a wonderful to see with Alexander's story. I think the Oliver Stone Alexander movie is underrated. I would give it a shot if you have not seen it. Colin Farrell, they kind of do weird, they have weird decisions. I get it. But I understood. They let the Irish and Scottish actors keep their accents. And one thought is because in some ways, Scottish Highlanders, that culture is actually very similar to the Macedonian culture. I thought, what's his name? Val Kilmer plays a good Philip. Actually, I thought the what's her name? Angelina Jolie as Olympia was very Olympias. His mother was very well cast, right? That's kind of who, Greek looking, beautiful, volatile. Um, I mean, Colin Farrell as Alexander, it's not bad. It's just problem halfway through the movie, the dye job starts to go bad on his hair. Um,
Well, so
yeah,
here is the issue though with Oliver Stone movies. Okay. And this is detouring into a side quest, but I've seen a number of them. But part of the problem with Oliver Stone movies is he does not have the right editor to work with him. For example, his Alexander movie, 175 minutes. Any
mm,
given Sunday, I actually enjoyed that movie. 157 minutes. That's pushing it. All right, that's pushing it. Nixon, which I really liked,
yeah,
okay, 192 minutes. That's way too long. Okay. And
yeah.
JFK 188. And then, my God, the director's cut is 205 minutes. I'm sorry. That's just, it's like Zack Snyder movies. Get to the point, tighten it up, move. And I like Zack Snyder, especially his Justice League cut was good,
Yeah.
right? The Snyder cut of that was good, but he needs a better
Well,
editor relationship.
you may have hit on it. It's either go shorter or go long, right? In other words, instead of a 3 hour movie, just do two parts, like Dune, the new Dune movies. Just do Alexander Part One, and then have an Alexander Part Two, right? Um, or turn it into an 8 episode or 10 episode series, right? There's so much stuff there. That's so many good stories packed into his life that it's always difficult to do these movies, it's difficult to do them justice. Um, I do fear, large scale battle scene movies are probably a thing of the past just because of the insurance costs and the costs alone. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Waterloo, right? From 1970.
Oh yeah, the Russian or Italian one, whatever, the European one.
No, no, no. The one with Rod Steiger as Napoleon,
Yeah.
right? It's I mean, it's remarkable how many. And then the Russians, during the Cold War in the 60s, the Russians were making these really good movies, and they could employ thousands of cheap Russian soldiers for these battle scenes. They made a War and Peace movie that's it's like 3 movies, right? 9 hours long. But the battle scenes are incredible because they just would have costumed, 10,000, 20,000 people in these battle scenes. It was incredible. You can't do anything like that today. I'm trying to think of the last. I mean, the one battle scene of the last 30 years that people always remember is the Braveheart one, right? Uh, of course, I mean every aspect of that battle in Braveheart was wrong. Um, but it's just the sheer joy of seeing all these choreographed people come together uh is just great. It's fun to see in a movie. The battle scenes in Alexander are underrated, the elephant stuff. There's actually a tragic story with that is they filmed a lot more of some of this battle footage, especially the battle in India, the Battle of the Daspes with the elephants. And the footage, half the battle footage got destroyed. There was some accident and the footage, all like millions of dollars worth of filming were destroyed in a fire or something happened to the literally the reels of film and and it's lost, right? But what was left still, I thought they did well, but they would be better off either making a mini series of Alexander or focusing on one aspect of his career, right?
Right. And because you have to do it in a way that tells something about that's important today, which the 56 version just lacked. Like it wasn't Spartacus talking about the civil rights movement, for example.
Right.
Okay. It didn't have that. But I want to switch though and stay on the Waterloo 1970 film that you mentioned. I saw that a ton growing up and I'd forgotten. I looked it up while you were talking about it. I forgot Orson Welles towards he was not in good shape then, man, but he was King Louis the 18th of France in that movie. I had forgotten about that.
You're right. I
Ah,
completely forgot about that.
wow, man. And then Christopher Plummer, the Duke of Wellington, that the battle scenes in that are unbelievable. I think it's on YouTube, so you can find it
Yeah.
without too much trouble. But also, you had mentioned the Tomb of Alexander. I saw a couple of articles recently that they think they found some uh, possible locations of where it
Right.
might be. I don't know if anything's come of that, but they'll try to figure that out. But if you could find that, that would be amazing. So uh, whoever's listening to this, let's get a really good Alexander miniseries. HBO, make it happen. You've got all the actors. All the people are there.
Yep.
You can bring back some of the cast from Chernobyl. They could be
For his
involved.
show. Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic. Now, let's talk about we need to come up with some reading lists here
Yep.
or some podcasts to listen to. What would you recommend to people if they want to learn more about Alexander? What books should they read?
So I got a I got a couple. I got one. I have it right here. I've read this book several times. Mary Renault, The Nature of Alexander. This is as a readable and fun introduction to Alexander the Great. All of it, military stuff is only part of it. Actually, it's she was a she wrote many novels and historical books, right? Studies of Greek history, and she loved Alexander. So this is an admiring biography of him. It's very readable. It's a lot of fun. I reread it every once in a while. Um, if you're interested in the military career of Alexander, this one, JFC Fuller, right? He also wrote the best book about Julius Caesar's military career that I've ever read as well. He's sort of I mean, this guy knows his stuff, right? JFC Fuller, by the way, is one of the guys that came up with Blitzkrieg warfare. He wrote stuff about it. The British Army said, okay, thanks, put it on a shelf. And some future Panzer commander named Heinz Guderian picked it up and read it. Okay, so JFC Fuller knows his military stuff. So the book's old, but the scholarship is amazing. And this goes in detail about all of his small, big battles, everything, right? Any little thing he covers. Um, there's a really good book that I don't have with me. Adrian Goldsworthy has written many books about Romans and Greeks, and he wrote one. If you actually want an introduction to both Philip and Alexander and their connection and why they should really be considered together, father and son, but also just simply as a continuation. Philip and Alexander by Adrian Goldsworthy. That's a book that'll cover Philip's career and then move into Alexander's. Those are probably the three books that I would recommend. Definitely the first one to start with would be Mary Renault, The Nature of Alexander. That's a fun book, and it's easy. It doesn't get into sometimes one worries in some of these biographies. It gets into such minutia detail. This is not one. This is one that it tells it as a story, right? History is a story. It's just thousands of different stories connecting, coming apart, or you can treat it as the story of one person, right? And the characters in his play. And that's when I taught history, that's how I taught history. I taught it as a story. Look at all these fun little stories because that's how people remember stuff. And probably some of the stuff that makes Alexander so memorable is because it's just one great little story after another for him, right? Like the story how he trained his horse Bucephalus, right? It was this untamable horse. His father, he said, "Buy that horse for me," and the father said, "That horse is crazy. I'm not wasting my money on that. I need a good cavalry horse. Screw that." And he said, "I'll pay for him," right? And his father made fun of him because he liked to sing, and that just stirred Alexander up. And this 10-year-old boy then tames this horse, right? Climbs on top of him, and then father's mockery turns to just fierce pride in that moment, right? All these great little stories. Another little story, Alexander had a basically a tutor, a guy that sort of whipped him into shape, right? And and he would force him to do, at first he would wake him up, force him to do these things. And then Alexander, 3 days into this training, decided the old man shows up at his door to wake him up, and Alexander's already up. And basically, he's like, well, I'm a king, or I'm going to be a king. If I have to do this stuff, I might as well choose to do it, right? Just one little story after another, right? Even the stories where don't show him in a good light, like the murder of this guy who saved his life, Clitus. That's it's such a compelling story, right? So if you want a story, if you like to read history as a story, then this is probably the one Alexander book I would recommend.
And if you want some good podcasts about Alexander, there was like a 3 or 4 part series on the Told in Stone podcast, which was very good and talked about why Alexander was so successful and also talked about the 2004 Alexander movie.
Right.
He had a different take on it than what you did, but he thought that the character one of the things he said was he thought that the characters who were Macedonian should have all had Scottish accents, all had the same accent, and represented them as kind of like a lower social class that was coming to the top, which was why they had a different sounding voice than everybody else did.
You know what? They did that in a movie, a very famous movie. They chose that idea that you did in the movie Spartacus, the famous Kirk Douglas movie. They purposely got all these slaves were Americans and gave them that American, and all the Romans were Brits. If you rewatch it, you'll notice that. And it was for that class reason as well. Um, One thing I wanted to mention, I just realized the podcast is an audio medium, not a visual. So when I brought this title up, I'm assuming that people who can't see this, it's called Mary Renault.
Well, the video is recording, so we're getting
Okay,
video too.
Mary
So
Renault, The Nature of Alexander. That's the book I'm recommending. Mary Renault, like the French car maker, The Nature of Alexander.
So, one other thing on my other podcast, I give people open mics, but here I'm going to do it a little bit differently. And then what I'm going to do instead of giving an open mic is let the guest suggest a future topic and just give an update to give you time to think about an answer. We have an interview lined up with a professor of, I hate using the word Byzantine because it's a creation and has no real meaning. It's just something we grafted on later. It bothers me, but a Byzantine era professor. We're going to talk about one of history's other greatest generals,
Oh,
Belisarius. And I'm in touch with somebody now to also potentially discuss Hadrian's Wall and some other areas related to Roman Scotland, which could be very interesting. And then we're going to bring Dr. Garish back to talk, I think, about Augustus, but there may be some other topics that we get in there. So that's future planning purposes for the Classical Antiquity Side Quest. Now, I've stalled enough, so I'm going to give you a chance to pick a future episode topic.
I would love I would love to talk about the third century emperors of Rome. Uh, a lot of the unknown heroes that helped save the Roman Empire. It could have fallen in the third century and it didn't, and it's thanks to these barracks emperors. Um, and the whole culture of third century Rome, which is Rome under, I mean, beleaguered. It was a military dictatorship, basically. You see you see these emperors. They were soldier emperors. They didn't last long. Even the heroes didn't last long. I would love to talk about the sort of the forgotten heroes and villains of the third century. Um, that period's been fascinating me a lot lately.
All right, so we've got a future episode lined up. And for those of you who are listening, we do have a voicemail box set up for my other podcast. So just use that same number, call in, ask a question, and I'll do my best to answer it or do my best to get the guest to answer it. The number is 540-632-0160. Thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. And remember, Rome was an empire without end. And that is true because we're still talking about this period of history today, no matter
That's right.
what we do. So tune back in. We'll have some more episodes, and I'll try to think of a regular tag when I end these. Haven't really thought of it yet. I thought about saying the word side quest in Latin, but I never took Latin, so I'm not going to do that. So we'll think about something else to talk about, and we'll see you here next time.
Thanks for having me on.